20 questions till 20 days till training camp. West Coast college football. Is the Pac-12 really that bad? A fabulous feature on Dennis Lindsey. The Jazz lose an assistant coach. Some NFL thoughts as we hit opening week. It's all on a jam-packed edition of Tip-Off. Boom, 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 boom. Is there anything more ridiculous than fantasy football draft and you suddenly really think you're like a GM? Boom, 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 boom. And you're like, I've got a philosophy on this. And da-da-da. Boom, 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 boom. And truly, we think we are like Kevin O'Connor or Dennis Lindsey or Tim Ruskell or whoever. Boom, 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 boom. And we think we're having those kind of impacts. But if our team loses, it doesn't really matter. Boom, boom, boom. We don't get fired. We just enter the league again. It is an edition of Tip-Off. We had our fantasy football draft last night. I loved it. Like, I'm sitting there. It's just a joke. I love it. It's so great because I'm sitting there and I got my sheet, which you can't see because of the glare. And if you look up at the top, like, I've got it pre-figured out by average draft position and what position each guy's going to go. And then Matt Ryan goes early, and he goes too early. I didn't expect Matt Ryan to go there. I kind of thought I was going to get Matt Ryan with the 47th pick of the draft, which was 20 positions above his average draft position. And, it all goes awry. And then I got this crazy idea, like, I actually laughed because it reminded me of O'Connor. In the middle of the draft, I'm like, O'Connor would never do this. O'Connor would never do this. I'm like, oh, my God, it's fantasy. Stop this. But in the middle of the draft, I just got this thought. Like, someone drafted Adrian Peterson, and I was like, what happens if he never gets healthy this year? I mean, he had a ACL, MCL, and in the videos I've seen of him, he doesn't look good. I was like, what happens if he never gets healthy? Oh, I should go get Toby Gerhart. Toby Gerhart's a perfect fifth back because what happens if Adrian Peterson is never healthy? And by the time I'm like watching the draft, like, oh, don't take Gerhart. I never planned on taking Gerhart. I just decided in the middle of the draft that all of a sudden that I might want Toby Gerhart, who's Stanford. So that's good. And it's just. Yeah. Anyway, hope you're all well and enjoyed it. And have got your fantasy football drafts going. I'm going to hit a bunch of NFL in the next 2 days. I'm totally geeked for it. I did a bunch of work on it. I love the NFL. But as always, we will always stay with our truths. Jazz, then NBA, and then from there we will move to the other things. Let's start with Jazz. I started a feature yesterday. We had 20 weekdays till the start of the draft, so 20 questions. What are the missing pieces to make the Jazz a contender? It's posted up on We Are Utah Jazz / Locked On Jazz, and there's really two things that we have to get, and one of them is we've got to become a top 10 defensive team. We were 20th in the NBA last year. We were really quite bad. We allowed 103.6 points per 100 possession last year, and it's not good enough. And you really have got to get down to 100 points per 100 possessions. So it's not as though we have a tiny little jump we have to make. We have to make a huge incremental defensive adjustment, change completely who we are and how we defend. The league average is 101.8. We weren't close. We were at 103.6. In fact, only 5 teams in the NBA were worse than 104 points per 100 possession. We are at 103.6. We are eerily close to one of the 5 bottom defensive teams in the NBA. So how does this happen defensively? Well, hopefully Mo Williams and Marvin Williams and Randy Foye bring a level of toughness, but more importantly, hopefully Derek Favors improves who we are. And then that got interesting to me because that led me to doing a little research off of this, and the research really has to do with what happens with. Oh, I better be able to find this. I can't find it. Don't tell me I lost it. Here it is. What does Favors do? And at the end of the year, I went and did some research, and what jumped out at me a little bit at the end of last year was that Favors last year played 70% of his minutes, I think it was, with Enes Kanter on the floor. Favors played 653 minutes with Kanter. So about 65%. He played about 1,100 minutes last year that I looked at. And Kanter, and with Kanter, he played 44% of his minutes with Kanter and only about 650 without Kanter. And his defensive rating without Kanter is 99.1. So we're there. Like when Kanter and Favors are not on the floor together, we're there. The Jazz really were – that lineup that the Jazz ran a tremendous amount last year with Favors and Kanter was really terrible. Now, I think there were some reasons for that. Training camp meant you didn't get rotations, and Ty was just trying to get a group that felt comfortable together, and that group ended up playing an awful lot together. And Ty never wanted to play Cantor and Jefferson together, and so it just kind of limited what happened. But that didn't work. So there is a chance we can get there because without Cantor in the lineup and Favors on the floor, the Jazz defensive rating was 99.1, which would make them a top 10 defensive team. And that's the first step for us to become a legitimate contender. I define contender as a top 4 team in the conference. The only thing that's a little disconcerting on this is a lot of these numbers are really skewed by the 100-plus minutes last year of Millsap, Jefferson, and Favors on the floor together when the Jazz defense was just entirely out of this world. Now, the hope is that we don't forget that. I mean, it was by far the best defensive lineup probably in the NBA of any group that played over 100 minutes. I could look at that. Probably worth looking at it. But we only allowed 78.5 points. Now, rarely do we go up against, per 100 possessions. Rarely do we go up against the top best teams with that. But still, that lineup was incredible. Take that lineup out. The only thing that was a little disconcerting to me is Favors and Millsap together. Favors is the 5, Millsap is the 4. They played 200 minutes together, which is not a lot. And their defensive rating was 101.5. So that's not bad. It's close to the 100 we need to get to. It's right about there. The more disconcerting one, kind of looking at stuff, was in the 312 minutes that Jefferson and Favors played together with just a regular shooting guard, small forward or shooting guard. The defensive rating was 106.4, which would make it one of the worst defensive teams in the NBA. I mean, a lot of belief here is that if we just put Favors into the lineup, that we're going to become an elite-level defensive team. Those numbers would lead us to believe that that's not true. And that's a little surprising, a little disconcerting. That, if Jefferson really so poor defensively, or his presence so poor defensively that even with Favors on the floor, we're still going to be a bad defensive team. If that's the case, first, that's a huge indictment on Jefferson, and then we got to figure out how we're going to score if Jefferson's not on the floor, because we're just a pound-it-down-low basketball team right now for the most part. And it was very, on that note, it's very interesting reading a great piece at Rockets.com about Kevin McHale, a long feature interview. McHale was talking about, hey, if I could get a team where I can pound it down low and start everything inside out, I would do it. But I don't have that roster this year, and there's very few teams in the NBA that do. And, you're reading that, and we do have that. We can't undersell how important that is, that Al Jefferson can go get the ball in that block and get something done almost all the time, somewhat regardless of who defenders are. He's definitely better against lesser defenders than he is against, but so is everybody. And his discrepancy is fairly significant. But it still kind of jumps out to how remarkably talented he is in the post. But we've got to be able to defend. And that fact that Favors and Jefferson combo didn't defend very well last year, or at least that the team wasn't very good defensively when the two of them were on the floor, from a numbers standpoint, is not a great sign. The great sign is, though, when Cantor's off, and you played that big lineup, and if you include that big lineup, then this team is where it needs to get to be a contender. So I thought that was some interesting work over the weekend. Scott Layden leaving the Jazz to go to be the assistant general manager at San Antonio. There's two sides to this story. Clearly, one is he would have liked to be the GM when O'Connor opened up that position. I would take, and the Jazz decided to take Dennis Lindsey, which is always a little hard. And so when the Spurs assistant GM job opened up, and that's such a great organization, and Scott's worked for such a bad organization in the past, that I think he knows the value of a good organization. And congratulations, Scott. He's one of the really good, he's a good guy. He's been important to Ty because he and Ty have been together for a long time. He hired Ty in New York. So it's a loss to have that high quality human being leave your organization. And it's a loss to Ty because that's a trusted voice. And I think that will have a fairly significant impact on this team. I don't exactly know, because I wasn't in on them, how the conversations went last year inside team meetings, but I'm just going to guess that if you think about what those coaches' meetings were last year, they involved the strength and conditioning coach, Mark McCown, but they also, who's been around for a long time, does things, out of the Jerry mold. He and Jerry very close. Mark's fabulous. Um, and you have Scott, who fits that mold, and Ty, and then you have new Sidney Lowe, new Mike Sanders, and Jeff Hornacek. Hornacek definitely has a different viewpoint on things. Sidney comes from a little bit of a different background. Sidney, in his first year with Scott there, probably just the dynamics of any kind of group. Sidney's probably a little quiet, voices his comments, but not with a lot of authority and a lot of punch, just because Scott's already there. Well, now Scott steps aside. There's now a little room in that for somebody to step forward with a louder voice. Will it be Jeff, who has a different viewpoint on how things necessarily should be done than Tyrone does, and that's what makes them a nice collaborative. But his John McLeod background is a little different. His Cotton Fitzsimmons background is a little different, though Ty played for Cotton too. Sidney's got a different background in who he's worked with and who he's been around, and now whoever they bring in. Eric Musselman was a name I liked. I thought might fit a little bit, though he is just hired at Arizona State as an assistant. You never know. He could still decide he wants to be in the NBA. Another one I would keep an eye on is Randy Livingston, the head coach of the Idaho Stampede. And the third one I would say is Brad Jones, who's the former head coach of the Utah Flash, and then was in Austin last year. Really an obvious name, and has been a part of the Jazz organization a lot. So that would be another name I would mention as a real possibility for Jazz assistant. It would seem as though that might match up. So those are some names. It just means that the voices are changing. This is just part of the evolution of who the Utah Jazz are as a franchise. But it's a loss because Scott's just a wonderful guy, and he's a trusted person, and so that is going to change a little bit of how the conversation happens inside that group. Losses can be not bad, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not sure it's bad for the Jazz, but it definitely is a loss. All right, the big story of college football this week was how bad the Pac-12 is. Let me throw you two theories on this and see what you think. One is that I'm not convinced that every conference second half group isn't very good. I mean, Washington State may not be very good this year. There's no reason to really think they should be that good. They weren't very good last year. Cal's surprisingly not very good. And Colorado's not very good. So the bottom half is not very good. The second thing I would point out here, and this is just making an excuse, frankly, but I think it's true, is the third tier. So you have the top tier, which is the Alabamas and those kind of people. And then we have the second tier, which is most Division I programs of the Big Six. And then the third tier, which is hard to define. Like BYU's probably in the third tier just because they're not in the Major Six. And Utah was just before they got into the Pac-12. That's not saying someone's bigger or better, but just scheduling-wise, how you schedule. The West Coast third tier is dramatically better than the East Coast and the Midwest and the Southern third tier. Like when West Coast teams go to try to find a non-travel game to play where someone's going to come to them and they don't have to go a long distance to play them, you're suddenly into the Big West type WAC type team. Though Nevada, Boise are all pretty good. Colorado State, Wyoming, they're not as good, and the Mountain West Conference Air Force isn't great, but they're pretty good. Whereas when you go to the South and you go to the East and you go to the Midwest and you play that second tier group, they're not good. They're not good at all. And so whether it's because California is such a vast recruiting base, but Fresno State is a pretty decent program. Nevada is it's really the Boise State effect. Boise State has gotten so good that and frankly, Utah and BYU got so good in the Mountain West that those programs brought everybody else. If they were going to compete and not lose 65-0 every Saturday, then they had to compete. And now those are the schools that when the Pac-12 teams have to find someone to play to bring into their building on an early game of the year that they play, and they're just dramatically better than the teams at the bad teams on the other side of the country. In turn, Pac-12 loses some more games. Now, the Pac-12 is not great. Cal might be terrible, but I think you got to realize that a little bit when you talk about it. All right, I got a bunch of stuff. I'm running out of time. I got a workman coming over here in a second, so the doorbell could ring and I could be like, "Oh, see you, bye." Wow, that was an interesting voice. NFL, gosh, I'm geeked. Few thoughts. I've always believed in this theory very strongly about picking the NFL. Everyone's a year early. In other words, go back to who everyone loved a year ago In all the preseason mags and all the preseason prognostication, whoever they loved a year ago are probably the right teams to love now. Because the NFL, everyone kind of knows there's gonna be this jump, and you got to, particularly as a media guy, you got to be like above it, and you got to be right, and so everyone jumps it a year early. So the two teams that everyone loved last year this time in the NFC were Atlanta and Philly. Philly's really not that less talented. Michael Vick's got there's some tarnish on them, and Andy Reid's going through all sorts of personal issue. But gosh, if Michael Vick stays healthy and they fix their defense coordinator position, why not the Eagles? The second one was Atlanta. They made the Julio Jones move. They made the John Abraham move. They added all these pieces. They did everything really correctly as a franchise. Demiroff's done a great job building that team. And here they were ready to go. And they were pretty close. They had a bad playoff. Matt Ryan had a bad playoff game, and they're 0-3 in the playoffs now under Ryan, and everyone's decided kind of the same way everyone decided. Eli sucked a while. So I would keep an eye on Atlanta, and I also would say Atlanta's going to be a huge benefactor of the New Orleans should be down. So they just have one less game that beats them up a little bit from where they've been before. The NFC West, to me, is interesting. The Niners statistically did a bunch of things last year they cannot duplicate. The turnover rate, Frank Gore's going to dive. Now, maybe Michael James and some of these other guys will be able to pick up on that. And they suddenly, I think, dropped to 9-7, or maybe even 8-8 in that range. And the question is, with St. Louis and Arizona being that bad, there's no reason why the Niners and Seattle both aren't 5-1 inside the division, which gives you, they split their one, and then they're both 5-1 in the division. They both suddenly very easily get to 9 wins because you only have to win 4 of your 10 out of division games when your division's that poor. Both of those teams may be able to do that. You could have 2 playoff teams out of the NFC West, somewhat based on how putrid Arizona and St. Louis are. Over on the AFC, the only one that I think people are missing there is, remember, if Billy Cundiff kicks a field goal, Baltimore wins the AFC Championship game. But again, they're a year older, and the Terrell Suggs injury is pretty significant. So I'm not sure that I'm really buying all the way on that team. Houston was the team a year ago everyone loved. They were right, and then they got hit by the injuries. So the question would be the loss of Mario Williams and some of the shifting that they did. I think they lost 2 or 3 guys on their offensive line, whether or not that puts them. But we may have a Houston-Atlanta Super Bowl on that theory a little bit. So I would just keep an eye on that. And the interesting one there is the AFC West, where San Diego is definitely on the downswing. Seems to be off where they have been with Norv Turner coaching. Never seems to turn. Denver with Peyton Manning, I'm not sure where they are, but I don't think Denver's as good as people think. Denver's a playoff team that added Manning. They were a fluky playoff team that won a bunch of games they probably should have never won. And so I would suspect that they're not quite that we really should be viewing them as a 6-10, 7-9 team that added Peyton Manning. Otherwise, Kansas City to me is interesting of where they sit. I just kind of feel like they've been under the radar. They've been acquiring talent. They really have a lot of talent on the defensive side of the football. You would think that should click in at some point. And then there's the Raiders. How much has Al Davis held back that franchise over the years? Because, frankly, Al Davis' system of football was terrible and didn't work to what we were doing today. And Carson Palmer flung it around pretty good in the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season last year. It will be interesting to see if McFadden stays healthy, whether or not they are able to get something going. The Raiders, I think the Raiders are a legitimate possibility to win that division, I guess, is what I'm saying. Bagley, if he's listening, is like jumping up and down, but I don't know anything, so why are you excited about that? All right, and in the insincere file, did everybody see Dwight Howard's piece that he gave? He put up a full-paid ad in Orlando thanking them for his time and how much he loved them. Woo! To me, it just shows me how lack of touch Dwight Howard has to how any of his actions impact anyone else. And I just wonder if that will in some way prohibit them from being as good as they need to be this year. Just somehow that Dwight's got an issue. All right, hope you have a good one. Mountain bikers out there, you'll laugh at what I'm doing today. I'm getting on my bike, and I'm following the point-to-point trail for as long as I can until I fade. We'll see how much I get in. All right, so I'll be a beaten mess by the time I see you tomorrow. Hope you guys are great. Good Labor Day. Good to talk with you. 20 questions, 20 weekdays till training camp. We'll continue with a second one today. Hope you're good. See you.